Welcome back. Tonight we're going to uncover one of the most remarkable stories ever told, the incredible transformation of a vast, untamed wilderness into the most powerful nation on Earth. This is the complete history of America, from the moment European explorers first glimpsed these mysterious shores, all the way through the crucible of World War II. Picture this. In 1492, two worlds collided when Columbus stumbled upon what he thought was Asia, but was actually a continent that would reshape civilization forever. We'll journey through brutal, early settlements, witness 13 colonies declare independence in an impossible revolution, and explore how a fragile republic expanded westward through gold rushes and manifest destiny, all while wrestling with slavery that would tear the nation apart in civil war. You'll see how America rebuilt itself, welcomed millions of immigrants, and transformed from a farming society into an industrial powerhouse. Finally, we'll examine how this emerging giant stepped onto the world stage through two world wars, evolving from reluctant participant to global superpower, setting the stage for the America we know today. But before we continue, we'd like you to take a moment and let us know where you're watching from, what time it is for you, and if you are listening to fall asleep or to kill time while learning history. And if you enjoy the stories we tell, like and subscribe to support us in making more content like this. Now let's begin our journey. In the beginning, there was ice, vast sheets of frozen time stretching across continents, locking away the world's water, exposing bridges of land where oceans would later flow. Somewhere between 15 and 20,000 years ago, perhaps even earlier, small bands of hunters followed the great beasts across these frozen highways. They didn't know they were discovering a new world. They were simply following life itself, tracking mammoth and caribou across the Beringian land bridge, that temporary gift of the Ice Age, connecting Asia to what would become Alaska. These first Americans spread like water, finding its level, flowing south through corridors between glaciers, fanning out across two continents that had never known human footsteps. Within a few thousand years, an astonishing diaspora had occurred. From the Arctic to Tierra del Fuego, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, human voices echoed in languages that would multiply into hundreds of distinct tongues. By the time European ships would appear on the horizon, perhaps 50 million people would call these lands home, speaking over 1,000 languages, living in societies as varied as the landscapes they inhabited. In the forests of the northeast, the Haudenosaunee, whom others would call the Iroquois, built longhouses that sheltered extended families and developed a sophisticated confederacy that would later inspire framers of a certain constitution. Their Great Law of Peace, established perhaps in the 12th century, created a democratic federation among 5, later 6, nations. Women held the power to choose and remove chiefs. Decisions required consensus. It was a living experiment in governance that had been refining itself for centuries. To the southeast, the Mississippian culture raised earthen pyramids that rivaled those of Mesoamerica. At Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis, a city larger than London in 1250 AD spread across the floodplain. 20,000 people lived within its wooden palisades, governed by priest-kings who tracked the movements of stars from atop massive mounds. They traded with peoples thousands of miles away. Shells from the Gulf, copper from the Great Lakes, mica from the Appalachians, all flowing through this American metropolis that would be abandoned before Columbus was born. In the southwest, the ancestral Puebloans, once called the Anasazi, built cities in the cliffs and created road networks across the high desert. At Chaco Canyon, they aligned great houses with celestial events, creating an architectural calendar written in stone. When drought came, they adapted, moved, survived. Their descendants would still be there when Spanish conquistadors arrived, living in pueblos that had been continuously inhabited for 1,000 years. The Great Plains, which romantic history would paint as an eternal sea of grass roamed by nomadic hunters, told a different story. Before horses returned to the continent with Spanish colonizers, the plains peoples were often farmers, growing corn and beans. Along river valleys, hunting buffalo on foot with communal drives that required intricate cooperation. The Mandan and Hidatsa built earth lodge villages along the Missouri River that became trading centers, connecting networks that spanned the continent. On the northwest coast, where the Pacific's abundance made agriculture unnecessary, the Tlingit, Haida, and dozens of other peoples developed complex societies based on salmon and cedar. They carved totem poles that were libraries of family history, held potlatches that redistributed wealth, and navigated the coastal waters in canoes that could hold 50 people. Their artists created works that would later influence Picasso and the Surrealists, though they had been refining these forms for millennia. In California, perhaps the most linguistically diverse place on Earth before European contact, hundreds of small tribes lived in relative abundance. The Chumash built plank canoes and navigated by the stars. The Pomo wove baskets so fine they could hold water. Acorns, not agriculture, provided the staple food for many, processed through techniques passed down through countless generations. This was not an empty wilderness awaiting discovery. It was a continent of nations, of trade routes that connected the Arctic to the Amazon, of agricultural innovations that would feed the world. Corn, developed from a barely edible grass into the staple crop of civilizations, was a feat of genetic engineering that took millennia. Potatoes, tomatoes, beans, squash, chocolate, vanilla, rubber, and dozens of other crops that would transform global cuisine and industry were all cultivated here first. The peoples of the Americas had their own names for their world. The Lakota called it Turtle Island. The Cherokee spoke of it as the land on the back of the great turtle. These were not primitive peoples waiting for history to begin. They were living their own histories, their own rises and falls of civilizations, their own philosophical and spiritual revolutions. When the climate changed and the great ice sheets melted, the first Americans adapted. When droughts came, they moved or innovated. When abundance allowed, they built monuments and studied the stars. They were fully human in all the ways that matter, capable of cruelty and kindness, war and peace, creation and destruction. They loved their children, honored their ancestors, wondered about the nature of existence, and told stories around fires that pushed back the dark. By 1491, the Americas were home to perhaps a fifth of the world's population. Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, was one of the largest cities on Earth. The Inca had built a road system that surpassed anything in Europe. Agricultural techniques in the Amazon had created islands of enriched soil that would puzzle scientists 5 centuries later. This was the world on the eve of contact, rich, varied, complex, and about to face an apocalypse that would kill 9 out of every 10 people within a century. But in 1491, children still laughed in 1,000 languages. Lovers still met in secret. Farmers still watched the sky for signs of rain. Artists still created beauty. The human story in the Americas had been unfolding for perhaps 20,000 years. In just one more year, everything would change. On October 12, 1492, the world broke in half and began to mend itself into something entirely new. Christopher Columbus, convinced he had found the eastern shores of Asia, waded onto a beach in what he would call San Salvador. The Lucayan people who met him there, the Taino who watched from the trees, could not have imagined that this moment would echo through centuries, that their world was about to be transformed beyond recognition. Columbus wrote in his journal that day, describing the people he met as very well formed, with handsome bodies and good faces. He noted their generosity, how they traded everything they had, how they swam out to the ships with parrots and cotton thread and spears. Within the same entry, he was already calculating how easily they could be enslaved, how readily they might be converted to Christianity. The contradiction at the heart of the European encounter with the Americas was present from the very first day. Admiration and exploitation intertwined like a double helix that would spiral through the centuries to come. The Spanish came first, driven by God, gold and glory, that trinity of motivations that would carry conquistadors through jungles and across deserts. Hernán Cortés landed on the coast of Mexico in 1519 with just 600 men, 16 horses, and a handful of cannon. 2 years later, Tenochtitlan, that floating city of perhaps 200,000 souls, had fallen. How does an empire collapse so quickly? The traditional narrative speaks of Spanish steel and gunpowder, of horses that seemed like monsters to people who had never seen them. But the real conquistador was invisible, microscopic, devastating. Smallpox arrived in Mexico in 1520, carried by one infected person on a ship from Cuba. The Aztecs called it Huicocalistli, the Great Pestilence. It killed Cuitlahuac, Montezuma's successor, after just 80 days of rule. It killed perhaps half the population of central Mexico within a year. Warriors died in their homes instead of on the battlefield. Children died in their mothers' arms. The sophisticated medical knowledge of the Aztecs, effective against the diseases they knew, was helpless against this alien plague. Francisco Pizarro conquered the Inca Empire with even fewer men, arriving in 1532 to find a civilization already reeling from civil war and disease. Smallpox had preceded him, killing the Inca emperor and his designated heir, sparking the war of succession that Pizarro exploited. With just 168 men, he captured Atahualpa, the victorious claimant, and held an empire of perhaps 12 million for ransom. The room filled with gold that Atahualpa provided, enough to crash the Spanish economy when it reached Europe, brought him only death. But the Spanish were not the only Europeans drawn to the Americas. The French approached differently, sending fewer colonists, more interested in trade than territory, at least at first. Jacques Cartier sailed up the St. Lawrence in 1534, claiming lands for France that were already thoroughly inhabited. The French would build their empire on beaver pelts and native alliances, on coureurs de bois, who lived among the indigenous peoples and often married into their communities. It was a different model of colonialism, though no less transformative in its effects. The English came later, but with a different vision. They came to stay, to recreate England in a new world, to build a city on a hill, as John Winthrop would later say. Their first attempts were disasters. The Roanoke colony, established in 1585, vanished entirely, leaving only the word Croatoan carved into a post. Jamestown, founded in 1607, nearly starved to death in its first winters. Of the 104 colonists who landed, only 38 survived the first year. They ate horses, dogs, cats, rats, snakes, and in the darkest moments of the starving time, perhaps even each other. What saved Jamestown was tobacco, that addictive weed that would build fortunes and destroy lives in equal measure. John Rolfe, who would marry Pocahontas in a union that briefly promised a different path for English native relations, developed a strain of tobacco that European markets craved. Suddenly, the struggling colony had a cash crop, and with it, an insatiable hunger for land and labour. The Dutch established New Amsterdam on Manhattan Island, purchased, they claimed, for 60 guilders worth of trade goods. Whether the Lenape who negotiated understood they were selling the land itself, rather than simply sharing its use, remains one of history's enduring questions. The Dutch brought a commercial sensibility to colonization, focused on profit over ideology, creating a remarkably diverse colony where 18 languages were spoken by 1646. Each European power brought its own diseases, its own desires, its own ways of misunderstanding the peoples they encountered. The demographic catastrophe that followed was unprecedented in human history. Within a century of contact, the indigenous population of the Americas had declined by roughly 90%. Entire cultures vanished, their languages dying with their last speakers, their knowledge systems disappearing like smoke. Yet this was not simply a story of extinction. It was also a story of adaptation, resistance, and survival. The Pueblos rose in revolt in 1680, driving the Spanish from New Mexico for 12 years. The Iroquois Confederacy played European powers against each other, maintaining their independence through shrewd diplomacy. New peoples emerged from the collision of worlds, the Métis in Canada, the Mestizos in Latin America, cultural bridges between worlds that were supposedly separate. The Columbian Exchange, as historians would later call it, transformed both hemispheres. Horses returned to the Americas after a 10,000-year absence, revolutionizing life on the Great Plains. Corn and potatoes traveled to Europe, Asia, and Africa, feeding population explosions that would reshape world history. Sugar plantations in the Caribbean would create a demand for enslaved labor that would tear 12 million Africans from their homes. Coffee, originally from Ethiopia, would find new homes in Latin American highlands. The tomato would transform Italian cuisine. The chili pepper would set Asian food on fire. By 1600, the age of exploration was giving way to the age of exploitation. The Spanish had extracted perhaps 180 tons of gold and 17,000 tons of silver from the Americas, wealth that would flow through Spain to fund European wars and inflate global currencies. The Portuguese were establishing sugar plantations in Brazil worked by enslaved Africans. The English were planning permanent settlements. The French were pushing deeper into the continental interior. The collision of worlds was complete, but the aftermath was just beginning. A new world was indeed being born, but it was not the one any of its creators had intended. It would be a world of unimaginable cruelty and unexpected creativity, of forced migrations and new identities, of destroyed civilizations and hybrid cultures. The history of America, that blood-soaked, dream-haunted ground, was truly underway. The morning mist rose from the James River as the Susan Constant, Godspeed and Discovery dropped anchor on May 14, 1607. The 104 English souls aboard these ships had survived the Atlantic crossing to establish what would become Jamestown, the first permanent English settlement in the Americas. They chose their site poorly, on a swampy peninsula, rife with mosquitoes and lacking fresh water, but it was defensible against Spanish attack, which seemed the more immediate threat than starvation or disease. Captain John Smith, whose tendency towards self-promotion would make him both famous and suspect to historians, wrote of those early days with a mixture of bravado and barely concealed desperation. The colonists, many of them gentlemen who had never worked with their hands, were spectacularly unprepared for the reality of building a settlement from scratch. They had come seeking gold like the Spanish had found, quick wealth to make their fortunes. Instead, they found hardship that would kill 2/3 of them within a year. To the north, a different vision of colonization was taking shape. The Pilgrims, those religious separatists who had first fled to Holland before crossing the Atlantic, made their compact aboard the Mayflower in November 1620. William Bradford, who would govern the Plymouth colony for over 30 years, later wrote of their arrival, "Being thus arrived in a good harbour and brought safe to land, they fell upon their knees and blessed the God of heaven who had brought them over the vast and furious ocean." Their Mayflower Compact, signed before they disembarked, created a civil government by consent of the governed, a radical idea that would echo through American history. The Pilgrims survived their first winter only through the intervention of Squanto, a Patuxet man who had been enslaved, taken to Europe, learned English, and returned to find his entire village dead from disease. The cosmic irony of his story, that the only English-speaking Native American for miles happened to appear just when the pilgrims desperately needed him, speaks to the strange confluences that shaped early American history. He taught them to fertilize corn with fish, to read the seasons of this new land, to survive where they would surely have perished. 10 years later, John Winthrop led a fleet of 11 ships carrying 700 Puritan colonists to establish the Massachusetts Bay Colony. His sermon aboard the Arbella, speaking of creating a city upon a hill, articulated a vision of American exceptionalism that would resonate for centuries. The Puritans came not as desperate adventurers or humble pilgrims, but as an organized migration, bringing families, livestock, tools, and a determination to build a godly commonwealth in the wilderness. The contrasts between the colonies reflected the diverse motivations that drove European settlement. Virginia developed as a society built on tobacco cultivation, requiring vast acreages and labour that would increasingly be supplied by enslaved Africans. In 1619, two events occurred that would define much of American history. The House of Burgesses convened, creating the first representative legislative assembly in the Americas, and a Dutch ship arrived carrying 20 and odd Negroes, the first recorded Africans in English America, though their initial status, whether enslaved or indentured, remains debated by historians. Maryland, established in 1634 as a haven for English Catholics, pioneered religious toleration out of practical necessity. The Toleration Act of 1649 guaranteed religious freedom for all Christians, a radical concept in an age of religious warfare. Pennsylvania, founded by William Penn in 1681, went even further. Penn's holy experiment welcomed all faiths and treated Native Americans as equals, at least in theory. He learned Lenape languages and negotiated treaties that he actually intended to honour, creating a period of relative peace that would last until long after his death. The Middle Colonies developed a different character entirely. New York, seized from the Dutch in 1664, retained its commercial orientation and ethnic diversity. Walking through New Amsterdam, turned New York in 1670, one might hear Dutch, English, French, German, Swedish, and various African and Native American languages. This diversity would become a defining American characteristic, though it was often seen as a problem to be solved rather than a strength to be celebrated. Carolina, chartered in 1663, developed as two distinct societies. The northern part, settled by small farmers from Virginia, grew slowly. The southern part, centered on Charlestown, later Charleston, became a plantation society from the start. Its founders brought the slave system wholesale from Barbados, creating a black majority colony where rice and indigo cultivation generated enormous wealth for a small planter elite. The fundamental constitutions of Carolina, partially written by philosopher John Locke, attempted to create a feudal society with hereditary nobility, a reminder that not all American experiments were democratic. Georgia, the last of the 13 colonies, established in 1732, began as a social experiment. James Oglethorpe envisioned it as a refuge for England's worthy poor, a buffer against Spanish Florida, and a silk-producing colony where slavery was initially banned. All three visions failed. The ban on slavery lasted only 19 years, silk production never materialized, and many of the poor colonists fled to South Carolina at the first opportunity. Throughout the colonial period, the relationship between colonists and Native Americans evolved from wary cooperation to increasing conflict. King Philip's War, 1675 to 1676, devastated New England. Metacom, called King Philip by the English, led a confederation of tribes in a desperate attempt to drive out the colonists. The war killed 1 in 10 colonists and an even higher percentage of Native Americans. When it ended with Metacom's death, native power in southern New England was broken forever. The colonists were transforming the land itself. European livestock trampled native plants. Pigs and cattle, allowed to roam free, competed with wild game. European diseases continued their devastating work, but the transformation went both ways. Colonists adopted native crops and cultivation techniques. They learned to navigate by native trails that would become colonial roads. They adopted native words, naming places and things for which English had no terms. By 1750, the 13 colonies had developed distinct regional identities. New England was becoming a land of small farms, shipping, and nascent industry. The middle colonies were the breadbasket, growing grain for export. The Chesapeake focused on tobacco. The lower South cultivated rice and indigo with enslaved labour. Yet common experiences were beginning to bind them together. They shared English common law, mostly Protestant Christianity, and an increasingly American identity. The Great Awakening of the 1730s and 1740s swept through all the colonies, creating the first truly American shared experience. George Whitefield preached to crowds of thousands, breaking down denominational barriers and challenging established authority. Jonathan Edwards spoke of sinners in the hands of an angry God, terrifying and inspiring in equal measure. This religious revival democratized Christianity and created networks of communication that crossed colonial boundaries. By the mid-18th century, colonial Americans were among the most prosperous people in the world. They were taller than their European counterparts, a sign of better nutrition. They had higher literacy rates. Land ownership, the basis of political participation, was more widespread than anywhere in Europe. Yet they remained colonists, subject to a distant king and parliament, their prosperity dependent on their place in the British Empire. The foundations had been laid for a new society, one that combined English law with religious diversity, economic opportunity with stark inequality, democratic ideals with systematic oppression. The contradictions were built in from the beginning, creating tensions that would eventually tear the colonies away from Britain and eventually tear the new nation apart. But in 1750, those cataclysms lay in an unimaginable future. The colonists were British subjects, proud of their liberties, loyal to their king, and increasingly aware that they were becoming something new, something American. The shot heard round the world rang out on Lexington Green at dawn on April 19th, 1775, though who fired it remains one of history's enduring mysteries. Captain John Parker's 77 militiamen faced 700 British regulars in the grey morning light. "Stand your ground," Parker reportedly told his men. "Don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." Within minutes, 8 Americans lay dead, and the war that would create a nation had indeed begun. But revolutions don't start with gunfire. They begin in minds and hearts, in coffee houses and taverns, in pamphlets passed from hand to hand. The American Revolution had been brewing since the end of the French and Indian War in 1763, when Britain found itself deeply in debt and looked to its prosperous American colonies to help pay the bills. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts. Each new tax sparked resistance, not just to the taxes themselves, but to the principle that Parliament could tax colonists who had no representation in that body. No taxation without representation became the rallying cry, but the issue ran deeper than money. The colonists had grown accustomed to governing themselves through their local assemblies. They had developed their own identity, distinct from their British cousins. Benjamin Franklin, testifying before Parliament in 1766, noted this transformation. The colonists, he said, considered themselves as much Englishmen as those born within the realm. But when asked if they would submit to Parliament's authority, he warned that force would be required. The Boston Massacre of 1770, where British soldiers fired into a crowd, killing 5, including Crispus Attucks, a man of African and Native American descent, became a propaganda victory for the Patriots. Paul Revere's engraving of the event, historically inaccurate but emotionally powerful, spread through the colonies. John Adams, in one of history's great acts of principled courage, defended the British soldiers in court and won their acquittal, arguing that facts mattered more than passion. But passion was building. The Boston Tea Party of December 16, 1773, was political theatre of the highest order. Men dressed as Mohawk Indians dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor rather than pay the tax on it. It was destruction of private property on a massive scale, what would today be called terrorism, but it electrified the colonies. Britain's response, the coercive acts that closed Boston's port and revoked Massachusetts' charter, united the colonies in opposition as nothing else had. The First Continental Congress met in Philadelphia in September 1774, bringing together delegates from 12 colonies. They were still seeking reconciliation, still professing loyalty to King George III while denying Parliament's authority over them. But events were moving faster than diplomacy. Local committees of correspondence were sharing information and coordinating resistance. Militias were drilling on village greens, arms were being stockpiled. When General Thomas Gage sent troops to seize colonial weapons at Concord, the network of resistance sprang into action. William Dawes and Paul Revere rode through the night, warning of the British approach. By the time the regulars reached Concord, the supplies were hidden, and hundreds of militiamen were converging on the area. The running battle back to Boston cost the British 273 casualties to the Americans 95. More importantly, it showed that Americans would fight. The Second Continental Congress convened in May 1775, with the colonies in a state of war, but not yet committed to independence. They appointed George Washington, a Virginia planter with military experience from the French and Indian War, as commander of the Continental Army. It was a political choice as much as a military one, binding the southern colonies to what had begun as New England's fight. For over a year, the colonists fought while professing loyalty to the crown, blaming Parliament and the king's ministers for the conflict. This fiction became increasingly untenable. In January 1776, Thomas Paine published Common Sense, a 47-page pamphlet that demolished the intellectual foundations of monarchy and made the case for independence in language any farmer could understand. "We have it in our power to begin the world over again," Paine wrote. The pamphlet sold 150,000 copies in a population of 2.5 million, proportionally the best-selling American book of all time. By spring of 1776, the middle ground was disappearing. King George III had declared the colonies in rebellion. British ships were bombarding American ports. Rumours spread that Britain was negotiating with German princes to hire mercenaries. On June 7th, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced a resolution that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. A committee was appointed to draft a declaration explaining the decision to the world. Thomas Jefferson, just 33 years old, was chosen to write the first draft. In a rented room on the second floor of a Philadelphia home, working on a portable writing desk of his own design, Jefferson crafted words that would echo through centuries. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." The Congress edited Jefferson's draft, removing, among other things, his condemnation of slavery, a deletion that would haunt the nation. On July 2nd, 1776, they voted for independence. On July 4th, they approved the final text of the Declaration. John Adams wrote to his wife, Abigail, that July 2nd would be celebrated by future generations with pomp and parade, with shoes, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other. He got the date wrong, but the spirit right. The Declaration was a radical document, not for its assertion of independence, many peoples had revolted before, but for its philosophical foundation. Governments, it claimed, derived their just powers from the consent of the governed. When government became destructive of the people's rights, the people had the right to alter or abolish it. This was the Enlightenment made political, the idea that ordinary people could create and recreate their own governments. But declaring independence and achieving it were different things. The British Empire, the most powerful military force in the world, would not let its colonies go without a fight. Washington's Continental Army was outnumbered, outgunned, and often unpaid. The winter at Valley Forge in 1777 to 78 became legendary for its suffering. Men marched barefoot through snow, leaving bloody footprints. Perhaps 2,000 died from disease and exposure. Yet they endured, held together by Washington's leadership and a growing sense of common cause. The war's turning point came at Saratoga in October 1777, where American forces surrounded and captured an entire British army. This victory convinced France to enter the war as an American ally, transforming a colonial rebellion into a global conflict. French money, French troops, and most crucially, the French Navy, would prove decisive. The war dragged on for 6 more years, fought not just by regular armies, but by partisan bands in the South, by Native American allies of both sides on the frontier, by enslaved people who fled to British lines seeking freedom. It was a civil war as much as a revolution, dividing families and communities. Perhaps a third of Americans actively supported independence, a third remained loyal to Britain, and a third tried to stay neutral. The final act came at Yorktown in October 1781. Washington and his French allies trapped Lord Cornwallis's army on a Virginia peninsula. As the British band played The World Turned Upside Down, 7,000 British soldiers marched out to surrender. When news reached London, Lord North, the Prime Minister, exclaimed, "Oh God, it is all over." The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, recognized American independence and granted the new nation territory stretching to the Mississippi River. It was an improbable victory. A collection of 13 quarreling colonies had defeated the world's greatest empire. They had not just won their independence, they had announced the arrival of a new age, one where people could govern themselves, where rights were inherent rather than granted, where the old hierarchies could be overturned. Yet the revolution was incomplete. The man who wrote that all men are created equal owned hundreds of enslaved people. Women who had managed farms and businesses, while men fought, found themselves excluded from political participation. Native Americans, many of whom had allied with Britain, faced dispossession. The Loyalists, perhaps 80,000 of them, fled to Canada or back to Britain, the first of many political refugees the United States would create. The American Revolution launched what historians call the Age of Democratic Revolutions. France would follow in 1789, then Haiti, then Latin America. The idea that people could create their own governments, that rights were natural rather than traditional, would spread around the world. But first, the Americans had to prove they could actually govern themselves. Winning independence was just the beginning. Now they had to create a nation. The cannon had barely cooled from the Revolutionary War when Americans realized that winning independence was simpler than exercising it. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris recognized the United States of America. But what exactly was this new entity? 13 states, jealously guarding their sovereignty, bound together by the Articles of Confederation, a document that created, in the words of George Washington, a half-starved, limping government. The problems were immediate and overwhelming. The Continental Congress couldn't levy taxes, only request funds from states that rarely complied. The war debt stood at $27 million to foreign creditors, and $40 million in domestic obligations. Continental currency had become so worthless that "not worth a continental" entered the language as an expression of complete valuelessness. States printed their own money, erected trade barriers against each other, and conducted their own foreign policies. In Massachusetts, the crisis exploded into violence. Daniel Shays, a Revolutionary War veteran, led thousands of debt-ridden farmers in an uprising against tax collectors and courts that were foreclosing on their lands. Shays' rebellion of 1786-87 terrified the nation's elite. If the government couldn't maintain order, if angry mobs could shut down courts and threaten arsenals, what had the revolution achieved? "I am mortified beyond expression," Washington wrote, watching from Mount Vernon as the nation he had helped birth seemed to dissolve into chaos. The call went out for a convention to revise the Articles of Confederation. What gathered in Philadelphia in May 1787 was an extraordinary assembly of what Jefferson, observing from Paris, called an assembly of demigods. Washington presided, his presence lending gravity to the proceedings. Benjamin Franklin, at 81, was carried to sessions in a sedan chair, offering wit and wisdom. Alexander Hamilton brought brilliance and ambition from New York. But the intellectual architect of what would emerge was James Madison of Virginia, a small, soft-spoken man who had spent months preparing, reading every book on republics and confederations he could find. The delegates quickly decided to scrap the articles entirely and create something new. Working in secret, windows shut despite the summer heat, they argued and compromised their way to a new form of government. The large states wanted representation by population. Small states demanded equality. The Connecticut Compromise created a bicameral legislature with both. The South wanted enslaved people counted for representation, but not taxation. The North wanted the opposite. The 3/5 Compromise counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for both purposes, embedding slavery's contradiction into the nation's fundamental law. The Constitution that emerged was a bundle of compromises, but also a work of political genius. It created a federal system that divided power between state and national governments. It separated powers among legislative, executive, and judicial branches, each checking the others. It was simultaneously conservative, protecting property and limiting direct democracy, and radical, creating a government that derived its authority from we the people. The ratification debates that followed were America's first great national conversation. Federalists, supporting the Constitution, faced anti-federalists who feared it created too powerful a central government. The Federalist Papers, 85 essays written by Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay, made the case for ratification, with arguments that still guide constitutional interpretation. The anti-federalists, less organized but no less passionate, demanded a Bill of Rights to protect individual liberties. State by state, the Constitution won approval, sometimes by the narrowest margins. The promise of a Bill of Rights proved crucial. When New Hampshire became the 9th state to ratify in June 1788, the Constitution became law. But without Virginia and New York, the Union would be incomplete. Both ratified narrowly, Virginia by 89 to 79, New York by 30 to 27. George Washington's unanimous election as the first president surprised no one. His journey from Mount Vernon to New York, the temporary capital, became a triumphal procession. At every stop, crowds gathered, young girls strewed flowers, and veterans wept. On April 30th, 1789, on the balcony of Federal Hall, Washington took the oath of office, adding words not in the Constitution, "So help me God." Washington understood he was setting precedents with every action. He established the cabinet system, appointing Jefferson as Secretary of State and Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury. He showed Congress respect while maintaining executive independence. He established the principle of civilian control over the military. Most importantly, he would voluntarily relinquish power after 2 terms, setting a precedent that would last until Franklin Roosevelt. Hamilton, brilliant and ambitious at 34, laid the financial foundation for the new nation. His report on public credit proposed that the federal government assume all state debts from the Revolution and pay all obligations at face value. Critics howled that this would enrich speculators who had bought depreciated bonds from desperate veterans. Hamilton argued that establishing credit was worth the inequity. His plan passed only after a dinner party bargain that moved the capital to the Potomac in exchange for Southern votes. The Bill of Rights, ratified in 1791, fulfilled the promise made during ratification debates. The First Amendment's guarantees of freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition established principles that would define American society. The other amendments protected rights ranging from gun ownership to trial by jury, from protection against unreasonable searches to reserving powers to the states and people. But consensus was fracturing. Hamilton's financial program, including a national bank, split Washington's cabinet. Jefferson and Madison argued the bank was unconstitutional, that the federal government could exercise only powers explicitly granted. Hamilton argued for implied powers, that the government could do what was necessary and proper to execute its enumerated powers. Washington sided with Hamilton, but the debate launched the first party system, Federalists against Democratic Republicans. The French Revolution tested American unity. When France declared war on Britain in 1793, many Americans wanted to support their revolutionary ally. Others, horrified by the terror's bloodshed, favoured neutrality or even Britain. Washington's neutrality proclamation kept America out of the European war, but couldn't keep European war out of American politics. The Jay Treaty of 1794, which settled outstanding issues with Britain, but seemed to favour British interests, sparked riots and burned effigies of Jay. Washington's farewell address in 1796 warned against the baneful effects of the spirit of party and against permanent alliances with foreign nations. But party spirit was already beyond control. The election of 1796 saw Federalist John Adams narrowly defeat Democratic Republican Thomas Jefferson, who became vice president under the Constitution's original system. Adams's presidency was consumed by foreign crisis. France, angry over the Jay Treaty, began seizing American ships. When Adams sent negotiators, French officials demanded bribes, leading to the XYZ affair and an undeclared quasi-war at sea. Federalists passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, allowing the president to deport foreigners and criminalizing criticism of the government. Democratic Republicans responded with the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, asserting states could nullify unconstitutional federal laws. The election of 1800 became a crucial test. Would power transfer peacefully between parties? Jefferson and Adams campaigned bitterly, Federalists warning that Jefferson would bring French atheism and bloodshed, Republicans claiming Adams wanted to establish monarchy. When Jefferson and his running mate, Aaron Burr, tied in electoral votes, the election went to the House of Representatives. After 36 ballots and Hamilton's behind-the-scenes manoeuvring for Jefferson over Burr, whom he considered unprincipled, Jefferson prevailed. On March 4, 1801, Thomas Jefferson walked from his boarding house to the unfinished Capitol to take the oath of office, a deliberate gesture of Republican simplicity. "We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists," he declared in his inaugural address, seeking to heal partisan wounds. The peaceful transfer of power from one party to another, something that had never happened before in modern history, validated the American experiment. The new nation had survived its birth pangs. It had created a functioning government, established its credit, avoided European wars, and transferred power peacefully. But enormous challenges remained. The nation stretched only to the Mississippi, with European powers controlling the rest of the continent. The contradiction of slavery festered at its heart. Native Americans faced relentless pressure from expanding settlements. The question of whether a republic could survive over such a vast territory remained unanswered. Yet there was reason for optimism. The population was growing rapidly, doubling every 25 years. The economy was expanding, educational institutions were multiplying, a distinct American culture was emerging. The experiment in self-government, so precarious in its first years, was taking root. The foundation was laid for expansion across a continent and for conflicts that would test whether any nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal could long endure. Thomas Jefferson never saw the Pacific Ocean, but in 1803 he doubled the size of the United States with a stroke of his pen. The Louisiana Purchase, 828,000 square miles, bought from Napoleon for $15 million, roughly 3 cents per acre, transformed America from an Atlantic coastal nation into a continental power. Jefferson, the strict constructionist who believed in limited federal power, wrestled with the constitutionality of his action. The Constitution said nothing about acquiring new territory, but the opportunity was too magnificent to refuse. Napoleon, needing money for his European wars, and having lost his enthusiasm for a North American empire after the enslaved people of Haiti defeated his armies, offered to sell not just New Orleans, which Jefferson had sought, but the entire Louisiana territory. Robert Livingston and James Monroe, negotiating in Paris, exceeded their instructions and agreed to the purchase. "We have lived long," Livingston said at the signing, "but this is the noblest work of our whole lives." Even before the purchase was complete, Jefferson was planning its exploration. Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, leading the Corps of Discovery, set out from St. Louis in May 1804. Their mission was scientific, commercial, and geopolitical. Map the territory, establish trade with native peoples, and assert American sovereignty. With Sacagawea, a Shoshone woman, as interpreter and guide, they reached the Pacific in November 1805. Clark carved into a tree, William Clark, December 3, 1805, by land from the U States. The Lewis and Clark expedition revealed an American West far more complex than imagined. Hundreds of native nations, with sophisticated cultures and extensive trade networks, already inhabited these empty lands. The Mandan and Hidatsa villages on the Missouri River were cosmopolitan trading centers. The Columbia River peoples controlled rich salmon runs. The Great Plains tribes were adapting to horses, transforming their cultures in ways that would define the popular image of Native Americans. But the idea of manifest destiny, though the term wouldn't be coined until 1845, was already taking shape. Americans increasingly believed they were destined by God and nature to spread across the continent. It was an intoxicating vision that combined religious mission, racial superiority, and economic opportunity. John O'Sullivan, who would give the movement its name, wrote of the fulfillment of our manifest destiny to overspread the continent, allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions. The War of 1812, sometimes called the Second War of Independence, tested American expansion. British support for Native American resistance, particularly Tecumseh's Confederation attempting to stop American settlement, provided one cause for war. Western war hawks like Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun saw opportunity to seize Canada and Florida. The war went badly at first. British forces burned Washington, D.C. in 1814, forcing Dolly Madison to save Gilbert Stuart's portrait of George Washington. But Andrew Jackson's victory at New Orleans, fought 2 weeks after a peace treaty had been signed, but before news arrived, gave Americans a triumphant ending to remember. Jackson emerged from the war as the embodiment of American expansion. A self-made man from the Tennessee frontier, he represented the democratic energy of the West. His presidency, from 1829 to 1837, marked the triumph of the common man, at least if that man was white. The Indian Removal Act of 1830, which Jackson championed, cleared the Southeast for white settlement by forcing native peoples onto the Trail of Tears to Oklahoma. Perhaps 4,000 Cherokee died on the forced march. The Creeks, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminoles suffered similar fates. Texas provided the next great expansion opportunity. American settlers, invited by Mexico to populate its northern frontier, soon outnumbered Mexican citizens in Texas. When Mexico tried to assert control, banning further American immigration and slavery, the Texans revolted. The Alamo's fall in March 1836, with all its defenders killed, became a rallying cry. 6 weeks later, Sam Houston's army defeated Santa Anna at San Jacinto with shouts of "Remember the Alamo." Texas became an independent republic, but everyone understood its destiny lay with the United States. The annexation of Texas in 1845 triggered the Mexican-American War, which many Americans, including Congressman Abraham Lincoln and writer Henry David Thoreau, opposed as an unjust aggression. But President James K. Polk had campaigned on expansion, and he delivered. American forces captured Mexico City in 1847. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 transferred California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona, and parts of Colorado, Wyoming, and New Mexico to the United States. Mexico lost half its territory. America gained its continental scope. The Oregon Territory, jointly occupied with Britain since 1818, nearly triggered another war. American settlers pouring over the Oregon Trail created facts on the ground. 54-40 or fight became the rallying cry, demanding all territory up to the Russian-Alaska border. But Polk, already fighting Mexico, compromised with Britain at the 49th parallel, securing the future states of Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. In just half a century, the United States had expanded from the Mississippi to the Pacific. The Gadsden Purchase of 1853 added the final piece of the continental puzzle, securing a southern railroad route to California. But this expansion came at enormous cost. Native peoples faced dispossession, disease, and cultural destruction. Mexico lost vast territories and thousands of citizens who suddenly found themselves ethnic minorities in an English-speaking nation. The expansion of slavery into new territories poisoned American politics. The California Gold Rush of 1849 exemplified both the opportunities and chaos of expansion. When James Marshall found gold at Sutter's Mill in January 1848, California had perhaps 15,000 non-native inhabitants. 2 years later, over 100,000 49ers had arrived from around the world. San Francisco grew from a village to a city almost overnight. Fortunes were made and lost. Chinese immigrants faced discrimination, but built communities. Native Californians faced genocide, their population dropping from 150,000 to 30,000 in a decade. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869 when the Central Pacific and Union Pacific met at Promontory Point, Utah, fulfilled the continental vision. A journey that took months by wagon now took days by train. The railroad brought settlers, connected markets, and sealed the fate of Plains Indians, who depended on buffalo herds that the railroad would help destroy. Frederick Jackson Turner, writing in 1893, argued that the frontier experience had created American democracy, individualism, and character. The availability of free land, he claimed, had provided a safety valve for social tensions and an arena for reinvention. But Turner wrote just as the Census Bureau declared the frontier closed. The continental expansion was complete. The legacy of Manifest Destiny was complex and contradictory. It created a continental nation with vast resources and strategic advantages. It spread democratic institutions and economic opportunity for millions. But it also involved conquest, dispossession, and cultural imperialism. The Mexican-American War gave America California and the Southwest, but also set precedents for overseas imperialism. The removal of native peoples cleared land for settlement, but violated every principle of justice and humanity. By 1850, the United States stretched from sea to shining sea. The question now was whether a nation so vast, with sections so different in economy, culture, and values, could remain united. The expansion that had seemed to fulfill American destiny also carried the seeds of the nation's greatest crisis. Every new territory raised the question, slave or free. The Continental Empire was complete, but the reckoning for how it was built was about to begin. On the morning of April 12, 1861, at 4:30 a.m., a signal mortar arced across Charleston Harbor toward Fort Sumter. That single shell, fired by Confederate forces, began 4 years of carnage that would leave 750,000 Americans dead, more than all other American wars combined. The Civil War had been coming for decades, a slow-motion collision between two incompatible visions of America, one built on free labor, the other on human bondage. The roots ran deep back to the Constitution's compromises over slavery, those careful evasions that counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person and required their return if they fled to freedom. For decades, American politics had been a series of increasingly desperate compromises trying to balance slave and free states. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, each attempted to manage the unmanageable contradiction at America's heart. Abraham Lincoln's election in November 1860 triggered the crisis. Though he promised not to interfere with slavery where it existed, his Republican Party's opposition to slavery's expansion was enough. South Carolina seceded on December 20th, 1860. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas quickly followed. By February 1861, the Confederate States of America had formed, with Jefferson Davis as president. Our new government, declared Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens, is founded upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. Lincoln, inaugurated on March 4, 1861, tried desperately to avoid war. "We are not enemies but friends," he pleaded in his inaugural address. "Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection." But when he attempted to resupply Fort Sumter, the Confederates forced the issue. The fort surrendered after 34 hours of bombardment. Remarkably, no one died in the battle that started the bloodiest war in American history. Both sides expected a short war. Young men rushed to enlist, fearing the fighting would end before they could claim glory. The First Battle of Bull Run in July 1861 shattered those illusions. Confederate forces routed the Union Army, sending soldiers and Washington picnickers who had come to watch fleeing in panic. The war would be neither short nor glorious. The early war favored the Confederacy, despite the North's advantages in population, industry, and resources. Robert E. Lee, who had declined command of Union forces to defend his native Virginia, proved a military genius. His Army of Northern Virginia won victory after victory. The 7 Days Battles, Second Bull Run, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville. "It is well that war is so terrible," Lee said, watching the slaughter at Fredericksburg. "Otherwise we should grow too fond of it." In the West, however, Union forces found more success. Ulysses S. Grant, a failed businessman who had resigned from the army for drinking, emerged as a fighting general. His capture of Forts Henry and Donelson opened the Confederate heartland. When critics complained about his drinking, Lincoln reportedly said, "Find out what whiskey he drinks and send a barrel to my other generals." The Battle of Shiloh in April 1862 shocked both sides with its carnage, 23,000 casualties in 2 days, more than all previous American wars combined. The war transformed as it lengthened. Lincoln, who had insisted he fought only to preserve the Union, gradually embraced emancipation. Military necessity, moral clarity, and political pressure from abolitionists and radical Republicans pushed him forward. On January 1st, 1863, he signed the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing enslaved people in rebellious states. "If my name ever goes into history," Lincoln said, "it will be for this act." The proclamation transformed the war's meaning. No longer just a fight to preserve the Union, it became a war of liberation. Nearly 200,000 black men, many formerly enslaved, enlisted in Union forces. "Once let the black man get upon his person the brass letters US," declared Frederick Douglass. "Let him get an eagle on his button and a musket on his shoulder and bullets in his pocket, and there is no power on earth which can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship." Gettysburg marked the war's turning point. Lee's invasion of Pennsylvania in July 1863 aimed to win a victory on northern soil that might bring European recognition and force peace negotiations. For 3 days, 165,000 men fought across rolling farmland. Pickett's charge. On the third day, 15,000 Confederates advancing across open ground into Union artillery and rifle fire epitomized the war's tragic grandeur. Half never returned. Lee's army limped back to Virginia, never to threaten the North again. 4 months later, Lincoln stood at Gettysburg to dedicate the cemetery. In 272 words, he redefined America. The nation was not just a political arrangement, but a proposition, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. The war was a test of whether any nation so conceived could endure. The honored dead had given their lives for a new birth of freedom. Grant, brought east to command all Union armies, understood modern war. His overland campaign of 1864 abandoned the dance of maneuver for relentless pressure. The Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, battles of unprecedented savagery, ground down Lee's army. "I propose to fight it out on this line," Grant telegraphed, "if it takes all summer." Meanwhile, William Tecumseh Sherman captured Atlanta and marched to the sea, bringing war to the Confederate heartland. "War is cruelty," Sherman said, "and you cannot refine it." The end came in April 1865. Lee, his army starving and surrounded, met Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. Grant, remembering Lee from the Mexican War, offered generous terms. Confederate soldiers could go home, officers could keep their sidearms, men who owned horses could take them for spring planting. As Confederate soldiers stacked their arms, Union forces saluted. "Honor answering honor," one participant wrote. 5 days later, John Wilkes Booth shot Lincoln at Ford's Theater. The president who had grown from a prairie lawyer into the great emancipator died the next morning. "Now he belongs to the ages," Secretary of War Edwin Stanton said. The assassination transformed Lincoln into a martyr and complicated the already difficult task of Reconstruction. Reconstruction began during the war and continued until 1877, an attempt to rebuild the South and integrate 4 million formerly enslaved people into American society. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th guaranteed birthright citizenship and equal protection under law. The 15th prohibited racial discrimination in voting. For a brief moment, democracy flowered in the South. Black men voted, held office, served in state legislatures and Congress. Hiram Revels of Mississippi became the first black senator, taking Jefferson Davis's old seat. But Reconstruction faced fierce resistance. The Ku Klux Klan and similar groups used terrorism to restore white supremacy. The Freedmen's Bureau, created to help formerly enslaved people transition to freedom, was underfunded and undermined. Sharecropping replaced slavery with a new form of economic bondage. The Compromise of 1877, resolving the disputed presidential election, withdrew federal troops from the South, abandoning black Southerners to their fate. By 1900, Jim Crow laws had created a system of segregation and disenfranchisement that made a mockery of the Civil War's promise. The Confederacy had lost the war but won the peace. It would take another century and another movement to begin fulfilling the promise of equality. The Civil War transformed America. It settled the questions of secession and slavery, establishing federal supremacy and human freedom. It accelerated industrialization as factories geared for war production continued expanding. It created the modern American state with income taxes, paper currency, and an expanded federal government. Most profoundly, it offered a new birth of freedom, even if that promise was deferred. The war's 750,000 dead left few families untouched. In North and South, women wore mourning black for a generation. The veterans, blue and grey, would march in parades and tell their stories until the 20th century. They had saved the Union and ended slavery, but at a cost that still echoes. As Lincoln had prophesied in his second inaugural, every drop of blood drawn with the lash was paid by another drawn with the sword. The payment was made, but the full redemption of that sacrifice remained unfinished business. Mark Twain called it the Gilded Age, capturing in 2 words the glittering surface and base metal beneath of late 19th century America. In the decades after the Civil War, the United States transformed from a war-torn agricultural nation into the world's leading industrial power. Fortunes beyond the dreams of European royalty were amassed by men who had started with nothing. Cities erupted from prairie towns. Railroads bound the continent with bands of steel. And in the shadows of unprecedented wealth, millions labored in conditions that mocked the promise of American opportunity. The captains of industry, or robber barons depending on perspective, bestrode the age like colossi. John D. Rockefeller methodically built Standard Oil into a monopoly that controlled 90% of American oil refining. His business practices, ruthlessly efficient, drove competitors into bankruptcy or forced them to sell. "I believe the power to make money is a gift of God," Rockefeller said, combining Protestant faith with corporate ruthlessness. By his death, he had given away $540 million, more than any American before him, funding universities, medical research, and churches. Andrew Carnegie, a Scottish immigrant who started as a bobbin boy in a textile mill, built an empire of steel. His mills fed the skyscrapers rising in Chicago and New York, the rails spreading across the continent, the bridges spanning rivers. Carnegie preached the gospel of wealth, arguing that the rich were trustees obligated to use their fortunes for society's benefit. He gave away $350 million, building libraries across America, because a library had given him his start. J.P. Morgan didn't build things, he built combinations. The banker's banker, he assembled corporate giants through mergers and reorganizations. When the panic of 1907 threatened to collapse the American economy, Morgan locked rival bankers in his library until they agreed to a rescue plan. His U.S. Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation, employed more workers than the U.S. Army. "I owe the public nothing," Morgan declared, embodying the era's unapologetic capitalism. These titans built on technological revolution. Thomas Edison's laboratories produced a stream of inventions. The light bulb, phonograph, motion pictures. Alexander Graham Bell's telephone shrank distances. The Bessemer process made steel affordable. The assembly line rationalized production. By 1900, America produced more steel than Britain and Germany combined. The Brooklyn Bridge, completed in 1883, stood as a symbol of American ambition, its Gothic towers and steel cables proclaiming mastery over nature. But industrialization's human cost was staggering. In Andrew Carnegie's homestead, steelworks, men labored 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, in temperatures that could reach 130 degrees. Children as young as 8 worked in textile mills, their small fingers ideal for retying broken threads. Miners descended into darkness before dawn and emerged after sunset, never seeing daylight during winter months. Industrial accidents killed 35,000 workers annually. There was no workers' compensation, no safety regulation, no limit to exploitation. Cities exploded with new immigrants drawn by industrial jobs. Between 1870 and 1920, over 25 million immigrants arrived, transforming American society. They came from Southern and Eastern Europe now. Italians, Poles, Russians, Jews fleeing pogroms. Ellis Island, opened in 1892, processed up to 5,000 people daily. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, Emma Lazarus wrote for the Statue of Liberty. But the reality was often suffocating tenements and grinding poverty. Jacob Riis, a Danish immigrant turned photojournalist, exposed urban squalor in How the Other Half Lives. His photographs showed families of 10 living in single rooms, children sleeping in alleyways, sweatshops where workers bent over sewing machines 16 hours daily. In Chicago's packing houses, described by Upton Sinclair in The Jungle, workers fell into rendering vats and were sold as lard. Sinclair aimed for America's heart but hit its stomach. His exposé led to the Pure Food and Drug Act, not labor reform. Workers organized in response. The Knights of Labor welcomed all workers, skilled and unskilled, black and white, male and female. At its peak in 1886, it claimed 750,000 members. But the Haymarket affair that year, where a bomb killed 7 policemen during a labor demonstration, turned public opinion against unions. The American Federation of Labor, led by Samuel Gompers, pursued a more conservative strategy, organizing skilled workers and seeking concrete gains, higher wages, shorter hours, safer conditions. Strikes convulsed the nation. The Great Railroad strike of 1877 saw federal troops firing on workers. The Homestead Strike of 1892 became a pitched battle between steelworkers and Pinkerton detectives. The Pullman Strike of 1894 shut down Western railroads until federal troops intervened. The rights and interests of the labouring man will be protected and cared for, declared George Bear, a mine owner, not by the labour agitators, but by the Christian men to whom God in his infinite wisdom has given the control of the property interests of this country. The populist movement arose from agricultural distress. Farmers, caught between falling crop prices and fixed debts, organised the People's Party. Their Omaha platform of 1892 demanded radical reforms, government ownership of railroads, graduated income tax, direct election of senators, inflation of the currency to ease debts. William Jennings Bryan electrified the 1896 Democratic Convention with his Cross of Gold speech, "You shall not press down upon the brow of labour this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." But Bryan lost to William McKinley and his campaign manager Mark Hanna, who raised unprecedented funds from terrified businessmen. The election of 1896 marked the triumph of industrial over agricultural America, city over countryside, gold over silver. The populists faded, but their ideas percolated into the progressive movement that would dominate the early 20th century. Progressivism arose from middle-class anxiety about the extremes of wealth and poverty, the corruption of politics, the chaos of industrial society. Muckraking journalists exposed corporate abuses and political corruption. Ida Tarbell dissected Standard Oil's monopolistic practices. Lincoln Steffens revealed urban political machines. Ida B. Wells documented the horror of lynching, though racial justice remained largely outside the progressive agenda. Theodore Roosevelt, ascending to the presidency after McKinley's assassination in 1901, embodied progressive energy. The youngest president ever at 42, he attacked malefactors of great wealth while carefully distinguishing between good and bad trusts. His Square Deal promised fairness for workers, consumers, and businesses. He mediated the 1902 coal strike, the first time a president had intervened as a neutral arbiter rather than on management's side. He pushed through the Pure Food and Drug Act, created national parks, and built the Panama Canal. Women led many progressive campaigns. Denied the vote, they organized for social reform. Jane Addams's Hull House in Chicago provided services for immigrants while training a generation of female reformers. Frances Willard's Women's Christian Temperance Union campaigned against alcohol and for women's suffrage. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of 1911, killing 146 workers, mostly young immigrant women, catalyzed safety reforms led by Frances Perkins, who witnessed the tragedy. Progressivism reached its peak under Woodrow Wilson, the professor turned president elected in 1912. His New Freedom program lowered tariffs, created the Federal Reserve System, and strengthened antitrust law. The 16th Amendment authorized income taxes. The 17th provided direct election of senators. The 18th prohibited alcohol. The 19th, finally, gave women the vote. It seemed the progressive era had reformed American capitalism and democracy. But progressivism had limits. It largely ignored African Americans, who faced disenfranchisement, segregation, and violence. The Great Migration beginning in 1910 saw millions of black Southerners move north seeking opportunity, only to face different forms of discrimination. Progressives often supported immigration restriction and eugenics, believing in Anglo-Saxon superiority. Their reforms regulated capitalism without challenging its fundamental premises. By 1917, when America entered World War I, the Gilded Age seemed a distant memory. The robber barons were dead or retired, their excesses curbed by regulation. Workers had won some protections. Women could vote. The federal government had assumed responsibilities unimaginable in 1870. But the fundamental questions raised by industrialization remained. How to balance capitalism's creative destruction with human dignity? How to preserve democracy in an age of concentrated wealth? How to fulfill America's promise for all its people? The Gilded Age and Progressive Era had transformed America from a rural republic into an urban industrial power. The changes were irreversible. As America entered the world stage as a great power, it carried both the tremendous productive capacity created by industrialization and the unresolved tensions between its democratic ideals and economic realities. The stage was set for America to reshape not just itself, but the world. The explosion that sank the USS Maine in Havana Harbor on February 15, 1898, killing 266 American sailors, echoed around the world. "Remember the Maine" became the battle cry of a nation eager to flex its newfound industrial muscle on the global stage. Though later investigations suggested an internal explosion, not Spanish sabotage, destroyed the ship, the truth mattered less than the opportunity. Within months, the United States had defeated Spain, acquired an overseas empire, and announced its arrival as a world power. The Spanish-American War lasted just 113 days, a splendid little war, as Secretary of State John Hay called it, but its consequences reverberated for decades. Admiral George Dewey destroyed the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay without losing a single American life. Theodore Roosevelt, resigning as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, led his Rough Riders up San Juan Hill in Cuba, though he actually charged up nearby Kettle Hill, and on foot since the horses hadn't arrived. The war's ease masked its significance. America had projected power across 2 oceans and claimed colonies from the Caribbean to the Pacific. The Treaty of Paris granted the United States control of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, while Cuba became a protectorate. The debate over ratification exposed deep divisions about America's global role. Anti-imperialists like Mark Twain and Andrew Carnegie argued that colonialism betrayed American principles. "We have pacified some thousands of the islanders and buried them," Twain wrote bitterly about the Philippines, "destroyed their fields, burned their villages, and turned their widows and orphans out of doors." The Philippine-American War that followed proved Twain prescient. Filipinos who had fought for independence from Spain now fought against American occupation. The conflict, lasting from 1899 to 1902 officially, but continuing as guerrilla warfare until 1913, killed 4,200 Americans and perhaps 200,000 Filipinos. American forces used tactics they would later condemn in Vietnam: strategic hamlets, free fire zones, torture, including the water cure, an early form of waterboarding. Civilizing the Philippines proved more difficult than conquering them. Yet empire had its attractions. Alfred Thayer Mahan's The Influence of Sea Power Upon History provided intellectual justification, arguing that great nations needed navies, which needed bases, which required colonies. Business saw markets for American goods and sources of raw materials. Missionaries saw souls to save. Social Darwinists saw the natural superiority of Anglo-Saxons destined to rule lesser races. Senator Albert Beveridge declared, "God has marked the American people as his chosen nation to finally lead in the regeneration of the world." Theodore Roosevelt, becoming president in 1901, embraced America's new role with characteristic enthusiasm. His "speak softly and carry a big stick" philosophy guided an assertive foreign policy. The Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine declared America's right to intervene in Latin American nations to maintain stability, making the United States the hemisphere's policeman. When Colombia refused to sell land for a canal across Panama, Roosevelt supported Panamanian independence, then negotiated canal rights with the new nation. "I took the canal zone," he later boasted, "and let Congress debate." The Panama Canal, completed in 1914, stood as a monument to American engineering and ambition. Cutting through mountains and swamps, defeating yellow fever and malaria, the canal connected the oceans and projected American power. The Great White Fleet, 16 battleships painted white, circumnavigated the globe from 1907 to 1909, announcing America's naval might. Roosevelt won the Nobel Peace Prize for mediating the Russo-Japanese War, the first American to receive the honor. Dollar diplomacy under President William Howard Taft replaced military intervention with economic influence. American banks and businesses invested heavily in Latin America and Asia, with the government ensuring favorable conditions. When investments were threatened, Marines followed. Nicaragua, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and Mexico all experienced American military intervention. General Smedley Butler, who led many interventions, later reflected, "I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism." World War I tested American neutrality and global engagement. When war erupted in August 1914, President Woodrow Wilson proclaimed neutrality, urging Americans to be impartial in thought as well as in action. But neutrality proved impossible. American banks loaned billions to Britain and France. American factories supplied the Allies with munitions. German submarine warfare threatened American lives and commerce. The sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, killing 128 Americans among 1,198 dead, outraged public opinion. Wilson won re-election in 1916 with the slogan, "He kept us out of war, but events forced his hand." The Zimmermann telegram proposing a German-Mexican alliance against the United States and resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare pushed America into war in April 1917. The world must be made safe for democracy, Wilson declared, framing the conflict in idealistic terms that would characterize American interventionism. American entry tipped the balance. The American Expeditionary Force, under General John Pershing, eventually numbered 2 million men. At battles like Belleau Wood and the Meuse-Argonne, American troops proved their mettle. The war's cost was steep: 116,000 Americans dead, 204,000 wounded. But America emerged as a creditor nation, holding billions in European debt, its industries booming, its president proclaiming a new world order. Wilson's 14 points outlined his vision for peace: self-determination for peoples, freedom of the seas, open diplomacy, and a League of Nations to prevent future wars. At the Paris Peace Conference, Wilson was hailed as a saviour by European crowds. But the Treaty of Versailles compromised his ideals, imposing harsh terms on Germany that would breed future conflict. The US Senate, led by Henry Cabot Lodge, rejected the treaty and League membership, fearing entanglement in European affairs. The 1920s saw America retreat from Wilson's internationalism, while paradoxically increasing its global economic presence. The Washington Naval Conference of 1921-22 limited naval armaments. The Dawes Plan restructured German reparations. American businesses and culture spread worldwide. Jazz conquered Paris. Hollywood movies dominated global screens. American automobiles, radios, and consumer goods set international standards. But isolationism had shallow roots. The Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928, outlawing war as an instrument of national policy, revealed American desires to shape world affairs without commitments. When the Great Depression struck in 1929, America's economic collapse reverberated globally, revealing international interdependence. The Smoot-Hawley tariff, raising barriers to protect American jobs, worsened the global crisis and contributed to the economic nationalism that would fuel fascism. By the 1930s, as fascism rose in Europe and militarism in Asia, American isolationism strengthened. The Nye Committee investigations suggested that munitions makers had dragged America into World War I for profit. Neutrality Acts prohibited arms sales to belligerents and loans to nations at war. America First Committee, led by Charles Lindbergh, argued against any involvement in European conflicts. The United States must not become the guardian of European peace, Lindbergh declared. Yet President Franklin Roosevelt understood that America could not remain aloof from global threats. His good neighbor policy improved relations with Latin America by renouncing intervention. His recognition of the Soviet Union in 1933 acknowledged new realities. As war clouds gathered, he began preparing America for conflict while maintaining official neutrality. The arsenal of democracy speech and Lend-Lease program supported Britain while keeping America technically at peace. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, ended isolationism forever. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, Roosevelt told Congress, requesting a declaration of war. America entered World War II not as a reluctant participant, but as the decisive force that would determine victory. The American century, as publisher Henry Luce called it, had begun. From the explosion of the Maine to the smoke over Pearl Harbor, America had traveled from provincial republic to global superpower. The journey was marked by contradictions, democratic ideals and imperial practices, isolationist sentiment and international engagement, peaceful rhetoric and military intervention. But the trajectory was clear. America had entered the world stage and could not leave it. The question was no longer whether America would lead, but how it would lead and to what end. As the sun rose on December 8, 1941, America awakened to a new reality. The bombs that fell on Pearl Harbor had shattered more than ships and lives. They had destroyed forever the illusion that two oceans could shield America from the world's conflicts. In the smoke and wreckage of that Sunday morning, the United States found its destiny as a global superpower, a role it had been approaching, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes eagerly, for half a century. The America that entered World War II was vastly different from the collection of 13 colonies that had declared independence 165 years earlier. From a population of 2.5 million in 1776, it had grown to 132 million. From a narrow strip along the Atlantic coast, it stretched across a continent and beyond to Hawaii, Alaska, and the Philippines. From an agricultural society, it had become the world's greatest industrial power, producing more steel, oil, and automobiles than any other nation. Yet for all its transformation, America remained true to its founding paradox. It was a nation conceived in liberty, that had practiced slavery, dedicated to equality that enforced segregation, committed to democracy, that denied women the vote until 1920 and effectively disenfranchised millions of its citizens. The American story had always been one of aspiration and failure, of reaching toward ideals while falling short, of proclaiming universal truths while practicing particular prejudices. The threads that run through American history, from the first peoples crossing the Bering Land Bridge to the pilots scrambling to meet Japanese Zeros over Pearl Harbor, reveal patterns that would shape the nation's future. The encounter between peoples, violent and transformative, that began when Columbus waded ashore, continued as America became the world's great melting pot and battleground of cultures. The tension between federal power and local authority that nearly tore the nation apart in 1861 persisted in every debate over government's role. The promise of opportunity that drew millions of immigrants remained both America's greatest attraction and its most challenging test. As 1941 ended and America mobilized for total war, the nation stood at a hinge point in history. The isolationism that had seemed so sensible to a generation scarred by World War I was dead. The industrial might that had transformed America would now transform the world. The democratic ideals that had inspired revolutions would be tested against fascist ideology. The American century was beginning, though no one could foresee its trajectory. Looking back from that moment of crisis and transformation, the patterns of American history suggested what might come. A nation that had always been expanding, first across a continent, then across oceans, would likely continue to extend its reach. A people who had consistently revolutionized technology, from the cotton gin to the assembly line, would probably continue to innovate. A society that had slowly, painfully expanded its definition of who belonged, from property-owning white men to a broader franchise, might continue that expansion. But history also suggested darker possibilities. The violence that had marked American expansion could continue on a global scale. The racial prejudices that had justified slavery and segregation might find new expressions. The economic inequalities that had produced both robber barons and radical labor movements could persist or worsen. The environmental destruction that had accompanied industrialization might accelerate. As Americans prepared for war in December 1941, They carried with them all their history, all their contradictions, all their possibilities. They were the heirs of native peoples who had built civilizations in the Americas for millennia, and of European colonists who had destroyed those civilizations. They were descendants of enslaved Africans and of those who enslaved them. They were children of immigrants who had fled poverty and oppression, and of nativists who wanted to close the door behind them. This complexity, this diversity of experience and perspective, was both America's burden and its strength. A nation founded on an idea rather than ethnicity, on choice rather than inheritance, had unique flexibility and unique fragility. It could reinvent itself with each generation, but it could also tear itself apart over competing visions of what it should be. The story of America from discovery to World War II is not a simple narrative of progress or decline, of heroes or villains, of destiny fulfilled or betrayed. It is a human story, full of courage and cowardice, wisdom and folly, kindness and cruelty. It is the story of people trying to create something new in the world, sometimes succeeding beyond their wildest dreams, sometimes failing catastrophically, always struggling with the gap between their ideals and their actions. As the American century dawned, the nation faced challenges that would test every lesson history had taught. The fight against fascism would demand unity from a diverse nation. The atomic age would require wisdom from a young country. The Cold War would test whether a democracy could maintain its values while confronting existential threats. The civil rights movement would challenge America to finally fulfill its founding promises. The questions raised by industrialization, immigration, expansion, and democracy would persist, demanding new answers from each generation. And so, dear listener, we reach the end of our journey through American history. From those first footsteps across the Bering Land Bridge to the moment America entered the global stage as a superpower, we've traveled together through centuries of triumph and tragedy, of dreams pursued and deferred, of a nation constantly becoming, never quite arriving at its destination. History never truly ends, of course. It flows like a great river, carrying us forward whether we will it or not. The America that emerged from World War II would face new challenges, make new mistakes, achieve new greatness. The story continues, written daily by millions of Americans and billions affected by American power and ideals. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you'll dream of those who came before, the countless individuals whose lives wove the tapestry of American history. The Pueblo farmer watching the stars from ancient observatories, the enslaved woman singing spirituals that encoded messages of freedom, the immigrant seeing the Statue of Liberty emerge from morning fog, the soldier writing a last letter home before D-Day. Each life a thread in the great American story, each thread essential to the whole. Thank you for joining me on this journey through time. If you found value in our exploration tonight, I hope you'll like and subscribe, so we might share more stories, more quiet moments of reflection on the vast human drama that is history. Until we meet again in this space where past and present converge, I wish you peaceful dreams and the gentle reminder that you too are part of history, writing your own chapter in the endless American story. Good night.